Today we're going to talk about African American employment in the past and how it is today. African Americans play a big role in our society. They've been in the U.S. since 1619, the year that Europeans first colonized in the Newfoundland. They have been working for and indirectly helping with the building of our country from the very start. Nowadays, some are owners of big companies, others are civil workers, but it wasn't so back then. Over the years, African Americans have found it a whole lot easier to find jobs than in the past. Now, African Americans also have a much wider variety of job opportunities. It is pretty clear and obvious that the employment of African Americans has increased. Well, here's a question for you. What did they do in the past, and how is it in the present? In the past, African Americans did not really have many options for their occupation. In the beginning of the African Americans' time in America, they worked as slaves. Many of the slaves had jobs that required hard labor. If they were on a farm or plantation, they would be planting, growing, and harvesting crops such as cotton, coffee, tobacco, sugarcane, or anything else their owners had wanted. Some had to do housework such as cooking, weaving, or even simply doing the laundry. And then there were those who worked at railroads, butchered meat, or worked under artisans such as blacksmiths, carpenters. Back then, you would find that there were a lot of African Americans with these jobs. Now, if you will look at how the present is, you can find that African Americans are having the same jobs as anyone else. You can go to any room in a school, and chances are that you'll find an African American teacher. Go to a random office, and you're still as likely to find an African American working there as any other race. Even our 44th president, Barack Obama, is an African American. Him being the first African American president of the United States shows that African Americans can get a job that whites could, unlike how it was in the past. There is a really significant difference in how it was in the past for African Americans and their occupations from how it is today. Job opportunities are now open for almost anyone as long as they satisfy the job requirements.
In the past, employment was a problem for most African Americans out there. You can just imagine how difficult life would be for someone who is having a hard time getting employed. Unemployment is an extremely bad situation for anyone to be in. Back when African Americans were slaves, finding a job was obviously not a problem, as they were forced to work despite no pay. It was actually when African Americans were freed that they had begun having trouble looking for a way to make a living. After African Americans were freed, there weren't many white people in the South who would employ African Americans. There would be a slim chance for African Americans to get employed, and even if they were employed, chances are they are going back to a farm or a plantation to do the exact same jobs they were doing as slaves. The only difference here would be they get paid. However, they would most likely get paid near or even under minimum wage. If you are unemployed African Americans living in Mississippi, it would be one of the most unfortunate things that can happen to you. According to the black codes in Mississippi, African Americans that stayed unemployed in Mississippi would be fined. Also, if you happen to stay unemployed after 5 days, the sheriff will find someone who is willing to pay for your fine as long as you work for them until a fine is paid off. It's pretty much slavery all over again. All because you can't pay for a fine for being unemployed. There's just no way out unless you either find a job in 5 days after being fined, or the person you're sent to work for is lenient enough to pay for your fine after a reasonable amount of time. The employment of African Americans does in fact get better when World War I started. Raises on African American salaries started in 1930s due to the many new industries in the North. Since then, too many African Americans migrated to the North to get their jobs. Due to this huge migration, the amount of unemployed blacks in the North increased much higher than the amount of unemployed white people. So in the end, not all African Americans were able to benefit from this raise, and left even more of them unemployed.
There are many laws that affected the employment of African Americans, both positive and negative. As I have mentioned earlier, the Mississippi Black Codes was one of them, as without proof of employment, the African American can be considered a vagrant. Texas also had their own black codes as well. In Texas, African American workers were bound to their contract. If they expressed any kind of disobedience, the African American workers could be fined by their employer. With the racism that goes on in the South, the employer will pretty much fine an African American worker for almost anything, no matter how small of an offense it may be. You can expect your low salary to go even lower if you are African American working in Texas. What's more, if you try to quit your job, you will lose all of your salary, and all your hard work and effort would have gone down the drain with it. Talk about harsh. Now let's talk a bit more about the positive laws that affected the employment of African Americans. One great example of this is the Civil Rights Act of 1965. This is also called the Affirmative Action. It prevented the employment of discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and natural origin. This allowed African Americans to worry less about being instantly blacklisted by employers and also gave them an equal job opportunity as anyone else would have.
As you can now see, African Americans nowadays have a lot easier time with employment than in the past. Now they can aim for whatever job they want, as they can be as qualified as anyone else for whatever job it is that they want.